For decades now, digital marketers have had to work to figure out how to get brands and websites more visible in search engines. Today, there's an even more difficult version of that problem, which is how do we get brands and websites more visible in LLMs? Because users are increasingly turning to AI to help answer their questions. It's the kind of problem that you would hope you could use experimentation to help figure out. But unlike a website A/B test where we can randomize users and track some metric that we have some control over or visibility into, optimizing for search engine visibility or LLM visibility is a totally different ballgame. We have no idea how these algorithms really work, and yet we need to be able to make some inference between the changes that we make on our websites or other digital properties and how we're showing up. So how do you use A/B testing for SEO? In today's episode, I sit down with two experts to help us explore the question. One is the CEO of an A/B testing tool for SEO. That's Will Critchlow of Search Pilot. And I also talked to Matt Reiss, who's a practitioner expert who's led the SEO testing program at companies like CarGurus, amongst others. I'm Ryan Lucht, and that's today's episode of Outperform. All right, well, so thank you for joining us. We should probably start at the beginning and just, cover what we're talking about when we refer to SEO A/B testing. What are we talking about?
Yeah, so the audience is probably pretty familiar with kind of user-centric testing where you're splitting the audience and showing different treatments to different people. SEO testing uses analogous methods, but is focused on splitting the pages of a website instead of the visitors to the website. And the reason for that is fundamentally that for any given channel, so if we're talking about Google search, for example, you kind of got to think of Google as being a single visitor. So you can't kind of split the visitor into buckets. And so our tests typically run on large websites like, for example, retail might run on the category pages or the product detail pages, and it runs on a group of pages rather than on a single page. And then some of those pages are in control and some of those pages are invariant. There's a little bit of other differences in how the statistics and mathematical approach works, but kind of that's the fundamental part. And the really important part from an SEO perspective is that these changes happen server side, so they're visible in the served HTML, and that there is no what would be called cloaking in the SEO world, which is serving different treatments to search engine visitors and real human visitors. And so it's very important that any given page is the same for all of the potential visitors who might visit it, whether that's a human visitor or a robot crawler.
Sure. And I definitely want to get into some of what you mentioned, like the statistical methods are different. We'll get there. I guess to keep things high level to start, at least, I am curious to jump straight to like, what are the measures of success? Like, how are we assessing whether or not our SEO tests are successful or not?
So the most common metric that we're talking about is organic search traffic. That is a nice proxy for all the kinds of value that you're really looking for. And we can go as far as measuring conversions or revenue, but obviously there's other sources of variance and noise and other factors that come into play there. And so we're typically saying the search engines do a pretty good job of sending relevant visitors, and getting more of those visitors is a good thing. And so that's our kind of generally our proxy. And we find that is more powerful than, for example, looking at rankings alone, which you might naively think an SEO test is. You might just look at, well, do we rank better when we make this change?
Right.
The problems with that are mainly twofold. One is there's a huge universe of potential rankings we could be talking about. So the long tail is extremely long, and you can't possibly actually track rankings across every possible keyword variation that anybody might use to find your website. So you kind of have to look at them actually finding you. And the second problem is that a lot of the tests that we run, and a lot of successful tests, affect not only where you rank, but also the click-through rate in the search results. So if you, for example,
Sure.
add better schema information or better structured data onto your page, you might have a more compelling snippet in the search results. Even without the ranking position changing, you might get more visitors from that query. And so that's why we kind of focus a lot on traffic. We could probably have had a sweepstake on how long it takes us to mention AI in this conversation, but with the growth of other discovery channels like whether it's Google's AI mode, whether it's newer channels like ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever it might be, we're increasingly moving into what we call a multi-metrics world. And I'm sure this is familiar to in your space, whether we're thinking of those as guardrail metrics or whether we're having hypotheses that could potentially apply to more than one channel. So the world is getting more complicated, but that's the kind of simple answer.
Yeah. Well, I imagine there's a user experience consideration there too, right? Like, who knows what's driving LLM visibility right now? I think we're all still kind of guessing, but at least on the traditional search engine front, I know, one of the things that Google is taking into consideration is how it proxies like the actual user experience once they're on site. So if you tested some change that was very good for pure ranking, but resulted in the wrong expectations when a user's clicking on the site or somehow other degraded the user experience, it would probably show up negatively in organic traffic over time. So you kind of have a guardrail by,
Yes, to some degree. And I think we would think about there are kind of three things going on there. We might, for some tests or some hypotheses, some changes, might be run as both a traditional kind of conversion rate test or user experience test and an SEO test separately to see the impact on those different things. And then in the SEO space purely, there are potentially two things going on. Google might directly be measuring user behavior in terms of what they call pogo sticking, right? Kind of clicking through to the website, being disappointed and going straight back and performing the same search again, essentially hitting the back button. They measure those kinds of things, which is a kind of directly measured searcher happiness score. But there's also a lot of AI and machine learning going on their end, where they're trying to use their own proxies for, we know that this will make users happy, or we, our machine learning algorithm believes this will make users happy. So there's quite a lot going on, and so increasingly the whole thing is kind of a black box, and we're testing against that, which again is kind of somewhat, I think, familiar when you're talking about human psychology. We don't necessarily know exactly which human levers we're pulling. We're kind of just measuring the effect of the change, and that's increasingly how it looks in organic search as well, whether it's AI powered or not, or whether it's an AI mode or whether it's kind of traditional search, which itself is becoming more AI powered. And so that kind of underpins a lot of this stuff in terms of why do we think it's increasingly important. SEO is less of a checklist, less of a recipe or a pattern that you can perform, and it looks more like trying to please. It's very similar to trying to please users, but it's just yet another kind of user that you're thinking about.
Yeah. So I do want to get a bunch more into the how, but I guess to back up briefly, I'm curious how you ended up working on SEO A/B testing and building Search Pilot. Like, was there an aha moment or like a series of discoveries that led you to this point of like, oh wow, applying A/B testing to SEO would be a highly valuable thing to do, and I should really dig into this further?
Yeah, so I guess it depends how far back we're going to go. Why do we get into working on the internet? Why do we get into various other things? The very short answer to why we got into SEO in the first place is that it sat at an intersection of a few interests that myself and my co-founder really had, particularly around the technology and the business. It was, especially when we got started in like 2005, it was the predominant way that people found websites and the way that kind of business happened online. And so we were very attracted to that, not just web design for design's sake or whatever else, but connecting to the business. We started an agency that we ran from 2005 to 2020, and Searchpilot actually spun out of that agency. And the kind of the beginnings or the origins of what would become Searchpilot came from that kind of consulting and agency work over the previous 10 or 15 years, where we just saw particularly large organizations with large websites really struggling to get things done for SEO, and to tell the value of those things once they'd done them. And was this a good idea? Some SEO consultant has told us to do this. Maybe that was us. Maybe it was somebody else. And was it a good idea? Did it work? Are we right here? And I think anybody who's ever come anywhere into the orbit of SEO will know that there's an awful lot of, there always has been an awful lot of snake oil, an awful lot of misdirection, an awful lot of a lack of science, really. And pragmatically, our clients found that challenging, and that was partly why they were struggling to get things done, because organizationally it was tough to make a case for these changes when you were just saying, trust me, this is going to be good. And also, kind of philosophically, we struggled with it. We really wanted to make good recommendations, to know that our recommendations were good, to be able to feel the validation that we'd added value. And so, yeah, it partly came from that. And then the tipping point, I think, was when we realized that the technology side had improved enough that this was a service that we could offer as a scalable platform. And I think when we got started in 2005, that would have been very difficult to do. By 2015, 2016, 2017, the technology platforms were there. CDNs were more prevalent. We had the cloud to support our scaling, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was kind of a convergence of opportunity and technology.
Yeah. If I ask for like a favorite case study or story of an SEO test that was surprisingly successful or just enormously successful, does anything in particular come to mind?
There's a few different ways I could answer that. I think if we think back to some of the early tests we ran that got us really excited at the potential and the prospect, they weren't necessarily surprising in the sense of, would we expect these changes to make a difference? But I think when we realized that we could quantify and measure that difference, and that sometimes the direction of change was not necessarily the direction that you might anticipate. So a classic example, quite early on, we ran some title tag tests, and these are like the most simple SEO tests you can run, just changing the HTML title in the page. And that's such an important element of the page because it's not only a ranking factor, but also a click-through rate factor, because it's often used in the search snippet. And the fact that this would make a difference for SEO is not controversial, has never been controversial. But embarrassingly, when we looked back at some of our consulting recommendations from years prior, we would have said things like, you should do some keyword research and find out the ways that people are searching for the products and services that you offer, and then you should incorporate those into your titles because they're very important, right? Classic everybody's made recommendations like that if you've ever worked in SEO. But we realized that is, it's true, but it's wildly insufficient. It doesn't tell you how to actually write those titles. And what we discovered when we started running these tests was you could have a hypothesis like, adding this particular keyword or this particular query or phrase into the titles is going to improve things. And sure enough, sometimes it did. Some of our biggest winners, right, plus 20% type numbers. But also, embarrassingly, sometimes minus 20%. And the complexity of the fact that getting more or less specific in how you phrase these things could lead you towards or away from the promised land in terms of what the confluence of Google's preferences and user preferences look like.
Right.
And those things are actually, it turns out, very, very hard to predict, just like you would expect it in kind of hypotheses in your world. And that just threw on its head. We expected it to work, but we didn't expect to be wrong as often as we were, or to have such variance in unpredictability in whether a test is going to be beneficial or not. And so I think that some of those early ones were some of the things that made us go, we're really onto something here, because it's actually impossible to make strong recommendations of what to do without a testing capability around that. So I don't know if those are like my all-time favorite, because they're not surprising in certain ways, but in terms of mindset shift, that was huge.
Yeah. What are some of the other treatments or types of experiments that people run under this umbrella of SEO testing besides title tags?
So for anybody familiar with SEO generally, it runs the gamut of most on-site changes. So we can't run a test against whether the New York Times links to you or something, because obviously that's not in your control, but anything on your own website. And so it falls into a few categories. I would say there's things that aren't particularly user visible, so things like structured data. They can sometimes be surfaced in the in the search results snippet, but the visitor to your website isn't necessarily seeing them. So whether that's meta information of the page, whether it's title tag probably falls into that category, whether it's structured data, those kinds of things. Then there's a class that is very heavily overlapping with any treatment that you might make for a conversion rate or a UX reason. So content changes, layout changes, particularly things like whether elements of the page are default visible on page load. So think accordions, whether are they expanded by default or collapsed by default. Ordering of the page, those kinds of things, which obviously have user experience impacts as well. And then there's another class that is unique to SEO tests, which is internal linking structures. So, for example, think related product links, for example. So you're on a PDP, a product detail page. Which products are recommended? How many products are recommended? What's the algorithm for recommending which products go with which products? That can be very impactful from an SEO perspective because it's hitting multiple levers and ranking factors that Google cares about in terms of discovery. So Google typically crawls the website by following links between pages, but also authority. It's kind of giving signals of which pages are important to you, the website owner. So there's quite a lot to that, and it's particularly important to test those things because it's a very non-linear, very opaque part of the algorithm. Historically, it's based on the PageRank algorithm, which was like Google's big insight back in the 90s. But even if it was just that, that's hard enough to compute from the outside.
Sure.
You can't even do that. And of course, it's not just that. It's way more complicated these days. So it's, for all intents and purposes, something that you just have to experiment against.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say maybe I'll choose a slightly simpler example than internal linking because I imagine that's like a real spider web to navigate. Let's say I want to run a test, maybe changing the order of some of the elements on the page. Like I think there's important information about the product or something that's just a little too low. I want to surface it. I think it might have SEO and user benefits. You foreshadowed some of the differences and the challenges methodologically in running these SEO tests. Maybe walk us through how they're different from my everyday run-of-the-mill A/B test. How are we, planning and approaching and executing an SEO test?
Right. So as I mentioned before, the key thing is we're looking to split the pages. So we have this treatment that you've got a hypothesis for. And so suppose that's running on product detail pages, for example. We're going to pick a site section, so a sufficiently large group of pages that we believe that we can get a suitably strong steer on whether something's been successful, and we want to split what we would call the site section, right? So that's the superset of control and variant. We want to split that into the control and variant buckets of pages, such that those two groups of pages are as statistically similar to each other as possible.
Okay, so we're not just rolling the dice and randomizing. We're kind
correct.
Of intentionally constructing.
So I mean, you could randomize. The challenges are that the distribution of traffic to pages is not like the distribution of user behavior, right?
Sure.
User behavior is much more amenable to a kind of law of large numbers type argument that you can normalize a lot of things. There's a very power law distribution of traffic to pages, right? A small number of pages dominate, and there's a very long tail. And so random shuffles can too easily be poor shuffles, essentially. And so you can end up with too many, with one bucket dominating the other in one metric or another. So we do more than that. So there's a variety of ways that you can kind of approach that problem, whether it's stratified sampling, whether it's different kinds of like repeated shuffles, and then comparing, on historic levels. There's a variety of ways of actually attacking that. But point being, yes, you need to be careful to try and build statistically similar groups of pages.
Can you give us a sense too of order of magnitude? Like, I know that's going to be a question people are asking.
How many pages?
Can I do this? Yeah, like, does it need to be hundreds of pages in the superset? I imagine this is prohibitively difficult with tens. Or do we need thousands?
So we have run tests on tens, but it's pretty unusual to be able to get that. We've tried essentially. Yeah. Hundreds into thousands. Okay. Our rule of thumb is that we want 1,000 plus organic visitors a day to the total group of pages, and we want that distributed across a good number of pages. And what that means in practice, like the more traffic there is, the smaller number of pages you can get away with, but you could never go down to 3 or something. Sure. So there is a bit of a trade-off, and we could get more into the complexities of that. But that's the kind of fundamental rule of thumb. But we often find that we're just pushing to run on as many as possible because you get more trustworthy data, but also more. You can extrapolate it in more trustworthy ways if you've covered a bigger subset of the total group of pages, total set of PDPs or whatever it might be.
Okay.
There's all kinds of rabbit holes we could go down around. There's a bit less of a trade-off in terms of how long. So you can run a test for longer in a user experience context in order to build up more data. That works a little bit less well in the SEO testing environment for reasons that we'll come on to around the fact that we're typically testing against a counterfactual forecast rather than directly comparing the two groups. And so the longer you run, the more the drift there is that could be down to the forecast being wrong rather than being actually an effect of the treatment.
Yeah. So I'm sorry I cut you off. We were getting here, right?
Right.
So now we have our control and variant groups of pages. Mm-hmm. We're going to apply the changes to those pages. So take us from there. In terms of that, building that statistical similarity, this is some of the area where I talked about some of the most active kind of R&D work that we're doing at the moment is around doing that in a multi-metrics sense. So having those buckets not only be balanced in Google traffic, but in LLM traffic and merchant center impressions and whatever else it might be. That's where some of the complexity is growing. But yes, right. So you've got your buckets. You apply the treatment to the variant pages, and then thinking about Google to simplify things, Google is going to recrawl those pages over time, and so the effect will kind of fade in as those pages get recrawled and reindexed. And we typically see that on the large sites that we tend to work with, that they're getting recrawled very frequently, right? So we will be tracking that kind of crawl rate, and it doesn't jump to 100%, but it's up into the 80-90% of pages that have been recrawled within days. And typically we're seeing effects within days or like small number of weeks, a couple of weeks type time frame. And as I mentioned, we want to detect a change over that kind of time frame, because if we have to wait longer and longer, there's a lot more uncertainty that's going into everything, because we're, as I mentioned briefly, we're not just comparing directly the traffic to the control to the traffic to the variant. And that's back to the power law stuff that I was talking about and a lot of seasonality and variability that can come into the mix. So what we in fact are doing is that we're comparing the performance of the variant pages to the counterfactual forecast of the performance of the variant pages. And that is built off all the historical data that we know about what happened to those variant pages before the implementation of the test, and what happened to the control pages after the treatment was applied to the variant. And that is essentially capturing seasonality, site-wide updates, algorithm updates, competitor changes, all of those kinds of things to build a stronger, more powerful, a more robust forecast of what would have happened had we not made the change. And we're comparing those two things and then basically bootstrapping credible intervals off that by reshuffling the buckets and seeing how the variance changes. Yeah, I'm sure we could do a whole episode just going on, all the causal inference methods that you're using under the hood. But I think you provided enough breadcrumbs there for our more technical listeners to without hopefully boring everybody else who's forgotten their university level stats. Yeah, I think plenty of folks have a pretty good guess as to what's going on just based on what you shared there. So obviously not an easy task to do, right? To construct these statistically similar groups and to, do causal inference in this way. So I guess there are some very obvious reasons why you use a platform like a Search Pilot to do this. I guess beyond all that, beyond the stats engine, what are the key capabilities that you need in place? Like, I guess what do you think of as the most important functionality of Search Pilot?
So obviously, there's what we just talked about, right? That bucketing engine is probably the single most kind of differentiated and powerful piece. But in addition, I would say there's an upstream and a downstream. So the actual ability to roll out the test itself is a core part of our platform functionality. So a lot of folks will be used to seeing the kinds of tests that you might run implemented with with JavaScript or some in the client side. We're doing our changes server side, as I mentioned, in order for maximum compatibility with all of the search engine crawlers, and in particular, a lot of the new LLM crawlers don't execute JavaScript at all. Right. So the ChatGPT real-time crawler, for example, and so we are we deploy either as an API integration server side, as a proxy layer, or in the edge, in the CDN layer, and make those changes on the server side. So that kind of piece of the functionality is a kind of powerful and important reason why somebody might use a platform like ours, because applying the kinds of treatment that we're talking about to an arbitrary subset of some thousands of PDPs, but not all PDPs across, it is not exactly how a lot of e-commerce sites would be set up to.
Yeah, it's a strange development task.
Yeah, exactly. And in particular, when we're talking about doing this repeatedly, this is not just a one-off ask. We're going to be saying, let's make dozens of these changes through the course of a year, because we're going to be retesting different hypotheses, and each time it's a different shuffle of these pages. Like, that ability to make those changes is a key part of our value prop. And then the other end is in the analysis and the visualization and the dashboards that come out once you're actually running these tests. And again, you'll be very familiar with this from your work, but how to try to avoid misleading ourselves or our customers into, it's very easy to chart these things in such a way that humans start spotting all kinds of patterns that are not, in fact, statistically valid. And so we do our best to kind of build things that don't fool us or our customers. And so the analysis engine that consumes analytics data, or data from all kinds of sources, but typically web analytics and Google Search Console and those kinds of sources, we ingest that data, we would perform the statistical analysis, and then provide the charts, the dashboards, and the metrics that go with that.
It's a craft in and of itself. So we got the broad overview from Will, but I wanted to drill even further into easy ways that marketing teams could start leveraging A/B testing for SEO right away. For that, I called up Matt Reiss, who formerly led the SEO testing program at companies like CarGurus, to get his suggestion on a super simple way that teams can get started right away: title tag testing. All right, Matt, so tell me a little bit about title tags as a use case for SEO A/B testing.
Sure. So to me, title tags are one of those things that are so obvious in some ways that a lot of people tend to forget they exist, right? Obviously, if you've got a typo or the text is missing or something embarrassing, you notice it and it gets fixed quickly. But people don't tend to think about these as a lever you can pull for driving SEO, for driving organic traffic, right? There's a lot of focus on the content-based methods of improving SEO, right? Trying to improve rank is obviously the one that people obsess over. Got to get to position 1, position 2. Ranking for additional keywords, which sometimes can be good if they're relevant, sometimes can be unhelpful if you're just kind of spamming and ranking for stuff you don't really belong on the SERP for. But title tags are interesting because you can kind of tweak and tune these and optimize these over time and drive a pretty meaningful increase in traffic without having to do all of that other stuff, right? You should be doing that other stuff. You should be investing in SEO broadly. But as far as like the first thing that I do with a new employer or a new client is look at the title tags and go, okay, are there any obvious missing keywords here? Anything we can test and start driving some increase in traffic just by affecting that click-through rate? I think I mentioned this when we chatted previously, right? But there's whole startups and companies built on optimizing email subject lines and getting open rates and click-through rates there, or You're starting to see something similar with text notifications. Title tags are kind of forgotten in that conversation a lot of the time, and it's an area where I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks to get their feet wet with SEO A/B testing, and also drive some pretty meaningful growth in traffic.
Sure, it's kind of the last mile of SEO, right? Like you've done all this work to rank the page, but how much are you leaving on the table at that step of click through?
Yeah, you could have a phenomenal, convenience store with the best prices and the best products, but if no one can read the sign out front, or if your neighbor has a more attractive logo or something, right? It's that very first step is pre your page, right? It's whatever that title tag text says. Yeah, rank obviously matters, but that text has a pretty big impact on if people want to click through or not to.
And you're building a tool for this now, title tag engine. Obviously, it's something you've had a fair bit of experience doing in the past. Can you tell us a little, like, I guess, how did you come to appreciate the power of title tags specifically as a testing use case?
Yeah, so I mentioned that it's pretty much my go-to for the first thing that I'll try to do in a new environment, whether that's one of the companies I've worked for previously or a client that I've worked with through 1T Consulting. And it's great for a few things. Like I said, it kind of is a relatively easy thing to set up with minimal infrastructure, right? You don't have to build out this full, multimodal testing solution just to change a couple title tags and kind of monitor them over time. And the other is, it's at the end of the day, it's a copy change, right? It's you're manipulating a couple of strings, adding a little bit of logic for what shows up when, and then with some relatively straightforward analytics, a couple of helpful off-the-shelf tools from Google like Causal Impact, you can see a ton of growth here. So it's something that I'm very familiar with. I've done a lot at some of the companies I've worked for. One case study that I always like to bring up, which kind of this sort of helps convince people if they haven't been convinced yet, is I was working for a company that had effectively like an e-commerce presence up in Canada. And for the most part, they'd kind of taken this good for the goose, good for the gander approach between the US and Canada, right? We'll translate it into French, sure, we're legally required to do that. But besides that, like nothing specific. And I remember one of the first tests we ran in the international market was literally just adding the words with reviews in parentheses to the Canadian variant of title tags. And it was neutral in the US. Okay, cool, whatever. Normally that would mean it got forgotten. But it drove a 30% increase in traffic in Canada. No change in rank, no additional keywords, nothing else had rolled out around the same time. But that was pretty powerful. And, since then, it's always a good go-to. It's something that you should be looking at continuously, right? Yes, you get some benefit from kind of test once, get a win, cool, roll that out and forget about it for another few years. Yeah, but most of the time, title tags are actually a pretty dynamic thing. And if you're not looking at them and changing them and testing them constantly, I guarantee you, at least some of your competitors are. If you look at, the Google SERP today versus a week from now versus a month from now for even your favorite websites, they're changing, right? People are adding and removing the word best kind of on an ad hoc basis, or capitalizing things, or if you're Yelp, you'll cram every keyword imaginable into a title tag, knowing it'll get truncated, but hoping that somehow the Google gods will smile on you. The other thing that I like a lot about title tag testing, and this gets back to why I'm building Title Tag Engine and what the focus is there, it's much more clearly measurable than some of the other things you can do to improve SEO and improve kind of organic traffic and organic presence, right? There's proven established tools for this. Like I mentioned Causal Impact, which is difference in difference analysis software that Google actually released years ago in R originally, and then an updated version in Python came out somewhat recently. And you just measure clicks, right? You roll your test out. You can do A/B, right? Champion, challenger. You can do multivariant, get as many as you can get a reasonable amount of traffic for each slice. And the goal of Title Tag Engine specifically is to make that more accessible and a lot easier to implement for smaller, mid-size e-commerce companies that don't have the full engineering team or the full resources that I've been used to at some of the bigger companies I've worked at.
You had mentioned this to me in a prior conversation, but much like any kind of synthetic control approach to running a quasi-experiment, I imagine you have to kind of check the control and variation groups you've constructed to make sure they are comparable before you go off and run this. I think you had an example from Car Gurus where maybe there were some outliers you had to filter out.
Yeah, so bucketing is important in this as in anything, but yes, because you are to some extent manually assigning buckets, right? Ultimately, it can be a little bit more randomized if you do go the hash route and get more granularity, but you want to make sure that all of your buckets drive a relatively equal amount of traffic on a historical basis, because what you don't want is for some outlier high performing page to land in either the control group or a test group consistently and skew your results as you're trying to compare, traffic between the two, right? If bucket A was always going to outperform control because this outlier is in there, that's not going to give you very meaningful test data. And I remember the example I called out with you was actually from Car Gurus as well. We had to manually exclude all Ford F-150 pages from SEO testing because it's the most popular vehicle in America, and it drove so much traffic as an outlier compared to everything else that we had to account for that manually when we were building the tests and analyzing results.
Yep. There's a rule of thumb when you're trying to measure billboards that's similar. There's no synthetic control for New York City.
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
just nothing to compare it to. And if you're in the tech space, probably very similar for San Francisco too. Where can folks find you if they want to ask you questions about running their own title tag tests?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me at Matt with one T at titletagengine.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, obviously. Again, Matt with one T and then Reiss, Reiss. And if you're interested, check out titletagengine.com. It's just a landing page for now with an email sign up. We send out like a little welcome email, and then there's plans for a newsletter with best practices around testing. And obviously, once we get closer to launch, we'll have some formal announcements there. But promise not to spam inboxes or do anything crazy like that.
Right on. Thank you, Matt. Thanks so much to Matt and to Will for joining us on this very special A/B testing for SEO edition of Outperform. Even if you don't work in SEO or LLM visibility, I have to imagine you picked up some interesting things that could be inspiration for other non-website, non-app experimentation use cases. For more content on experimentation, feature flagging, AI, and all the rest, subscribe here to the Datadog Community YouTube channel and keep it locked for more Outperform. I'm Ryan Lucht, and until next time, keep experimenting.